Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that half the people you know could be gone within a few months. No medicine, no hospitals, no antibiotics, only fear. In the year 1347, Europe faced a nightmare unlike anything in recorded history. A mysterious disease arrived without warning. Healthy people suddenly developed high fevers. Pain spread through their bodies.
Dark, swollen lumps appeared beneath their skin, and in many cases, death followed within days. No one understood where it came from. Some blamed poisoned wells. Others believed it was a punishment from God. Many thought the end of the world had begun. Villages emptied, cities fell silent, entire families disappeared without anyone left to bury them.
By the time the nightmare finally slowed, an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe had died, with global estimates reaching much higher. It became known as the Black Death. But here's what most people never learn. For centuries, people believed the Black Death was a curse, a punishment, or even poisonous air drifting across the land. The truth was far smaller, so small that no one living in the 1300s could have seen it. The real killer was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Today, scientists know this tiny organism causes plague, but medieval Europe had no microscopes, no knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of how diseases spread. To them, the plague seemed almost supernatural. Modern research suggests the disease likely began thousands of miles from Europe, in the grasslands of Central Asia. There, wild rodents carried the bacteria naturally. Most of the time, the disease remained hidden within animal populations. But then something changed. Tiny fleas feeding on infected rodents picked up the bacteria. When those rodents died, the hungry fleas searched for new hosts. Sometimes those hosts were humans. As trade expanded across Asia, the invisible enemy traveled with it. Merchants carried silk, spices, gold, precious goods, but hidden inside sacks of grain, wooden crates, and the dark corners of merchant ships came infected rodents and fleas. The very trade routes that connected civilizations also connected epidemics. One of the most famous routes, the Silk Road, linked east and west like a giant highway. Every caravan, every port, every marketplace became another step in the plague's journey. By the mid-1300s, the disease reached the Black Sea. From there, merchant ships unknowingly carried it toward Europe. Every harbor welcomed new trade, but no one realized they were also welcoming one of history's deadliest pandemics. The greatest danger wasn't an invading army. It wasn't famine. It wasn't war. It was something no one could see. And once it arrived, there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it. In October 1347, a fleet of merchant ships sailed into the busy port of Messina on the island of Sicily. At first, people were relieved to see them. The ships had traveled long distances. They were expected to bring valuable cargo, silks, spices, and precious goods. But something was terribly wrong. As dock workers climbed aboard, they were met with silence. Many sailors were already dead. Others lay on the decks, burning with fever. Their bodies were covered in dark, swollen lumps. Some were too weak to speak. Others died before anyone could help them. The city's leaders reacted quickly. The ships were ordered to leave the harbor immediately, but it was already too late. The plague had stepped onto European soil. Invisible fleas had already jumped from ship to shore. Infected rats into warehouses, marketplaces, and narrow city streets. Within days, people across Messina began falling ill. No one understood what was happening. Doctors were powerless. Priests prayed without answers. Families locked themselves inside their homes, hoping the sickness would pass them by. It didn't. Merchants fled the city trying to save their lives. Instead, they unknowingly carried the disease with them. Every road became a pathway for the plague. Every trading port became another outbreak. From Sicily, the Black Death spread to Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and beyond. By the following year, it was sweeping across France, Spain, England, and much of Europe. Entire villages disappeared from maps. Church bells rang almost constantly. Gravediggers could no longer keep up. In many places, there were simply too many dead and too few living. The plague wasn't marching like an army. It moved quietly, house by house, street by street, city by city. And wherever it arrived, life as people knew it came to an end. As the plague spread, terror spread even faster. It often began with what seemed like an ordinary fever, a headache, chills, exhaustion. But within hours, the illness became something far more frightening. Painful swellings appeared beneath the arms, around the neck, and in the groin. These swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, could grow as large as an apple. For many victims, they became the symbol of certain death. Some developed dark patches beneath their skin, caused by bleeding under the surface. To frightened medieval Europeans, it looked as though the body itself was turning black. Although the name Black Death became common centuries later, those terrifying symptoms helped shape the image people still associate
associate with the plague today. The disease moved with terrifying speed. A person who looked healthy on Monday could be dead before the weekend. Doctors stood helpless. Medicine in the 14th century was based on ancient beliefs, not scientific evidence. Many believed illness came from an imbalance of the body's four humors. Others blamed poisonous air known as miasma. Their treatments reflected those beliefs. Some burned fragrant herbs, others carried flowers or spices beneath their noses. Doctors wore long robes, gloves, and the now famous bird-like masks filled with aromatic plants. They hoped the pleasant smells would protect them from poisoned air. Today, those masks have become one of history's most recognizable symbols, but they offered little protection against a bacterium carried by infected fleas. Desperation led people to try almost anything. Some drank strange mixtures of herbs and minerals. Others underwent painful bloodletting, believing it would remove the illness from the body. None of it stopped the plague. As fear grew, logic often disappeared. Rumors spread through towns faster than facts. Some believed the storm had aligned in a deadly pattern. Others claimed strangers had poisoned wells. Communities turned against outsiders. Innocent people were blamed, persecuted, and sometimes killed because frightened crowds wanted someone to hold responsible. The plague wasn't just destroying bodies, it was destroying trust. Neighbors feared neighbors. Friends avoided friends. Parents sometimes became separated from their own children. In many homes, the silence after illness arrived was more terrifying than the disease itself. For the first time in generations, people began to wonder if civilization itself could survive. As the months passed, the Black Death was no longer just a medical disaster. It became a crisis that reached every part of society. Entire villages fell silent. In some places, every house stood empty. Fields were left unplanted. Crops withered where no one remained to harvest them. Livestock wandered freely, with no owners left to care for them. The rhythm of everyday life simply stopped. The dead came so quickly that traditional funerals became impossible. Churchyards overflowed. New graves were dug every day. When there was no more room, large burial pits were created to lay hundreds of victims to rest. It was a heartbreaking decision, made not from cruelty, but from necessity. Even those responsible for burying the dead often became victims themselves. Across Europe, essential workers disappeared. Blacksmiths, farmers, carpenters, teachers, priests, doctors. Entire professions were suddenly missing. Communities struggled to survive without the people who kept daily life running. Food became harder to produce. Trade slowed dramatically. Many towns that had once been filled with noise and commerce became eerily quiet. But something unexpected also happened. For centuries, most ordinary workers had very little power. There were always more people than jobs. Now, the opposite was true. With so many lives lost, survivors became incredibly valuable. Landowners desperately needed farmers. Workshops needed skilled craftsmen. Builders needed laborers. For the first time in generations, many workers could demand higher wages, better conditions, or choose where they wanted to work. Some governments even tried to stop wages from rising by passing strict new laws, but changing society proved far more difficult than passing new rules. The Black Death had done more than reduce the population. It had changed the balance of power. Many historians believe these shifts weakened parts of the old feudal system, giving ordinary people opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. Out of unimaginable tragedy, Europe's economy, its social structure, and even its future began to change. The plague had taken millions of lives, but it had also transformed the world that survived. For years, it seemed as though the plague would never end. Every new season brought fresh outbreaks. Every caravan, every ship, every crowded town could become the next disaster. But slowly, something began to change. In some cities, the number of new deaths started to fall. No one in the 14th century fully understood why. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about fleas. They didn't know how diseases truly spread. Yet through painful experience, people began discovering something important. Distance saved lives. One of the first places to turn that observation into policy was the thriving port city of Venice. Merchants arriving from affected regions were no longer allowed to unload their cargo immediately. Instead, their ships were ordered to remain isolated before entering the city. This waiting period eventually became
became known as quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. No one knew the science behind it, but the results were clear. Separating the sick from the healthy slowed the spread of disease. Soon, other port cities adopted similar measures. Special isolation buildings called lazarettos were established outside busy harbors. Travelers showing signs of illness stayed there until it was safe to enter the city. For one of the first times in history, communities weren't just reacting to disease, they were trying to prevent it. It marked the beginning of organized public health. The plague also changed the way cities thought about cleanliness. Waste removal improved. Markets became more regulated. Officials began paying closer attention to sanitation, crowding, and disease outbreaks. These ideas were still far from modern medicine, but they represented an important shift. Instead of accepting epidemics as unavoidable fate, people slowly began searching for practical ways to fight them. The Black Death hadn't only exposed humanity's vulnerability, it had also revealed humanity's ability to adapt. Every painful lesson became the foundation for future generations, and although the plague would return in smaller outbreaks over the centuries, the world would never face it quite the same way again. The greatest weapon against the next epidemic wouldn't be fear, it would be knowledge. When the worst of the Black Death finally passed, Europe was almost unrecognizable. Entire generations were gone. Countless villages had vanished. Across the continent, empty homes stood abandoned. Fields returned to wilderness, and in many towns, silence replaced the sounds of everyday life. But history has a remarkable pattern. Sometimes the greatest periods of change begin after the darkest moments. With millions of people gone, land became easier to obtain. Workers became more valuable than ever before. For centuries, many peasants had little choice but to serve powerful landowners. Now they could negotiate, demand better wages, move to new towns, or learn skilled trades. The balance of power was beginning to shift. Cities also began to grow again. Trade slowly returned. Markets reopened. Craftsmen rebuilt workshops. New businesses appeared where old ones had disappeared. Out of tragedy, new opportunities emerged. The Black Death also changed the way people thought. For generations, many believed disease was simply a punishment that humans could not escape. But surviving communities began asking different questions. How can we prepare? How can we protect ourselves? How can we understand the natural world instead of fearing it? Those questions encouraged closer observation, careful record keeping, and a growing curiosity about science and medicine. Universities expanded their study of anatomy, disease, and the human body. Doctors slowly began relying more on observation than tradition. Progress was slow, but the direction had changed forever. Many historians also believe that the social and economic changes following the plague helped create conditions that later supported the Renaissance. Artists, engineers, scientists, and thinkers began challenging old assumptions. Innovation accelerated. Knowledge spread more quickly. The world that emerged after the plague was not the same world that had entered it. The Black Death had destroyed millions of lives, but it had also reshaped economies, challenged ancient beliefs, and opened the door to a new era of discovery. Sometimes history doesn't move forward because everything goes according to plan. Sometimes it moves forward because humanity is forced to rebuild from its greatest losses. For centuries, the Black Death remained a mystery. People remembered the suffering, the empty cities, the fear, but no one truly knew what had caused it. Then, more than 500 years later, science finally uncovered the answer. In 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, Swiss-French physician Alexandre Yersin identified the bacterium responsible. It was later named Yersinia pestis. At last, humanity had a face for the invisible enemy. Today, we know far more than medieval doctors ever could. We understand how plague spreads. We know how to diagnose it, and with modern antibiotics, most cases can be successfully treated if caught early. But here's something many people don't realize. The plague never completely disappeared. Small numbers of cases still occur each year in different parts of the world, usually in wildlife populations where the bacteria naturally survive. Thanks to modern medicine, these outbreaks are closely monitored and are nowhere near the scale of the Black Death. The greatest legacy of the pandemic isn't the disease itself, it's the lessons it taught us. The Black Death transformed public health. It encouraged quarantine, improved sanitation, better record keeping, and eventually the scientific method that would reshape medicine forever. Centuries later, when the world faced new pandemics, many of those same principles were used again. Isolation, disease surveillance, contact tracing, public health planning.
Technology has changed, medicine has advanced, but the fundamental challenge remains the same.
How do we protect one another from something we cannot see? The Black Death also reminds us that history is never just about kings, wars, or empires. Sometimes, the smallest organism on Earth can change the destiny of millions. It reshaped governments, redefined economies, accelerated scientific thinking, and permanently changed the relationship between humanity and disease.
Perhaps that's why, nearly 7 centuries later,
The Black Death still fascinates us, not because it was history's deadliest pandemic alone, but because it revealed both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization. Every generation faces challenges that seem impossible. Every generation believes its crisis is unlike any before. Yet history tells a different story. Again and again, humanity has endured. We have learned, adapted, rebuilt, and moved forward. The Black Death was one of the darkest chapters in human history, but from that darkness came discoveries that continue to save lives today. The plague changed the world forever, and in understanding its story, we better understand our own. If you enjoy watching the content, subscribing to the channel is the best way to support the work and never miss future updates.